Oh, how are you doing, especially with your new office layout?
Oh, I am doing well. I've moved my this is the east side of my this thing is it's in my garage, this place that I built. So that's where I used to be down that end, and now I've put my little card catalog down there, which I was so lucky to get.
Yep.
That was
I saw your tweet.
Yeah, I was thrilled. It was it belonged. Go ahead.
Saying hi, Tim.
It belonged to a public school here in town, and they closed. It was a school that they closed, and then one of the women who was an administrator of the school had taken it. You know, they were going to throw it away, so she took it home, and then she just she's getting rid of things and decided to sell it. So I didn't get as good a deal as I was hoping, but I got a screaming deal.
That's good.
So
good.
I've started moving my files. It was actually full too. It was the entire card catalog filled with all of the cards from this public school. So I've been pulling the rods out and eliminating the cards and replacing it with my cards slowly.
Didn't they have done that before sending it on?
Sorry?
Didn't they have done that before sending it on?
Yeah, apparently they didn't. It was just they just left it. They left everything in there, and it was kind of the books were gone, but the references to the books, the card catalog. And I actually asked my friend at the Historical Society whether or not she thought this was anything, that a record of the books that a public school had in this town during this time period was interesting to anybody. And she said, yeah, it might be, but, not interesting enough that I want to store boxes and boxes of cards forever. So that was it. Tim is writing in. Hi, Tim. Tim's writing in the chat.
Hi. Can you hear me?
Yes. Yep. Hi.
Oh, good, because I'm Wi-Fi and phone challenged today. So
yep. So
a blank screen and maybe sound, maybe not.
So what is that? What is this? Who are these historians, and what is this privatization myth?
Right. Well, this amateur historian who's a YouTuber is very much a World War II guy, and lots of his stuff is about individual battles. But on the side, he does maybe 10%, maybe a little bit more, on sort of economics, come politics, come debunking certain things that many people, particularly those on the far right, think is for or against the far right elements. And one of his semi-tropes, if I turned around and said to us five, name one thing that we think illustrates what socialism is. And partly because, although he's a Brit, he's made a lot of his fandom come detractors are US based. There's no distinction between outright Stalinism, stroke Maoism versus, say, somebody like Howard Wilson or something, as in socialist UK late 70s. Or R.E. Bevin for the National Health Service immediately after World War II. And of course, he narrows it down deliberately because elsewhere it's a bit fuzzy, as in government control of companies. And as soon as the Nazis took over, and as soon as they managed to get the dictatorship running, by the Reichstag burnt and Parliament suspended and all of that type of stuff, and they'd really wound up their totalitarian elements. They started putting their own people within the management of all the companies, and/or were saying things like, we will buy at the rate we tell you all of your whatever, steel, explosives, whatever, particularly if it was anything really to do with the war effort that hadn't even started at that point. And I think he makes a good case on that narrow front.
Mm-hmm.
He's a guy who's done so well, because I sort of giggle a bit at you and your fantasy with Ali Abdul, who was obviously clearly a relatively well-paid doctor, has obviously jumped on board to what of all things YouTube and saleable for YouTube, and has seemingly made himself virtually a millionaire, if not already. Sort of thing. He's got to be getting. Tick, who is Lewis something, TIC. I can't remember what it stands for, but it's just an acronym to take his name off the page. He used to work in retail, and he clearly has had enough of standard basic employment within the retail industry overall. And I'm not quite sure whether it was sort of like household goods or whether it was clothing or, worst comes to worst, food and beverage type retail, as in a manager for McDonald's or something. But he really wants to debate, and he clearly wants to engage generally. And he used to publish his video, if there was one that week, once in 10, 15, 20 weeks in this, at 5 p.m. British time, Monday. Recently he started doing a second one. I don't think he announced why, but he just did it. And the last one has a question from a user, and he uses those in most instances to do the non-battle ones. I mean, we're up to episode about 30 just on Stalingrad because of the detail he goes to. And he mentions Piketty in this instance because he's got a couple of quotes from Piketty where he feels that Piketty doesn't know what a socialist is. and it's like, yeah, now how much of that is a loss in French translation versus a loss because Piketty is clearly coming from the left, French left, and that has a certain culture stroke vocabulary behind it.
Vocabulary, shared assumptions,
as opposed to picking up from like a US anti-left or a US left side, or even an English speaking.
Yeah. And
I thought I'd throw it in, see if any of you guys have got. I think the one I've referenced is and the privatization bit is 25, 30 minutes. However, this guy is clearly obsessed. He's done a big debunk on Hitler himself, as in taking from his failed artistry, as it were, period in the early 20s, through his very slow walk to Damascus conversion, as it were, into a far right person. And obviously things happen in the middle, like the beer house putsch and all the rest of it.
Is his argument that the slow walk to Damascus has something to do, or has more to do with finding out what he can develop a constituency around rather than his own actual
changes? I think a lot of that, who who is or what is politically Hitler was around the fact of he suddenly realised that you put him in front of a crowd of usual sort of people that ended up as being brown shirts or something, and he could hold the crowd.
Right.
And he's effectively, I can't make any money painting pictures because nobody wants them.
Right.
But I can start making some money by talking. And then, of course, he got really involved with what became the Nazi Party. And he's not even member number one. So, you know, it existed at a level before Hitler, but not much. And it went through a multiple series of changes of names.
Right.
As
right.
all political parties do.
So then the interesting,
Then he got nicked for the beer house push.
Right.
And had this nice quiet year in Landstuhl prison to write Mein Kampf.
Or dictated.
At which point it took off.
Yeah.
Now obviously he's clearly been speaking to people who he feels are very German, very pro-German, and the rest of it, as to why we lost World War I. It's also at the same time, and you know, there are film clips and stuff of our mate Adolf with a pistol in his hand, walking through bits of, I can't remember whether it's Munich or Berlin, against the stuff that's the Sparkist revolution stuff, you know, Rosa Luxemburg and all that stuff that was in the early mid-20s. And clearly there's an evolution there until he actually finally gets into the swing of being able to talk to 50 people, then 500, then 5,000, then 50,000. It's quite
and it's not only that, it's also that the fact that it's that particular type of audience that he is successful at riling up and motivating, right? And so that, you know, and so that has resonance in our own time, right? You know, if Trump had found a different audience, he might have been a different politician.
Absolutely. So I see there's a very good parallel between 45 and manga versus this, because as soon as you start to become involved in the upper class discussion between the banks, between the industrialists, he comes over as being different. He doesn't rant and rave in quite the same way, etc., in terms of even within, say, like Ian Kershaw's 2-volume biography. And there's a German who's done a more recent one that's also 2 volumes, and he's almost identical in where it splits. You know, it's like pre-war and war and post and onwards. And the elements of what went on, how it went on, how it got off the ground, could it have been stopped, and how close is the likes of the current Tory party. We've got to select a new Boris Johnson. Is it going to be Boris Johnson 2? Or is it going to be a Maggie Thatcher 2? Or is there enough people going to catch common sense and we end up with a Ted Heath type?
Right.
So
right. Well, and in America, right, there, you know, it could be argued that, you know, there were crazies and then there were apparatchiks in the Trump orbit, right? And so, and some of them did have, well, and that's one of the things actually that sort of does fascinate me about fascism in Europe, you know, before Nazism kind of goes off the deep end and starts wiping lots of people out and sending people to concentration camps, that there is something going on that is, you know, not certainly a different spin on, in, you know, what we, you know, if we were feeling generous, we would call industrial policy, right? And, and as you were saying, Tim, the Nazis, were sort of price fixing and, and sort of encouraging cartels and that sort of thing, especially with respect to the war effort. Well, yeah, that would be like, that would be not that unlike the military industrial complex, right?
And no different to what the UK was doing either, really, because that's how you manage a war.
Yeah.
It's not. This is not a relatively minor war like Vietnam or the Falklands, for instance,
right.
As impactful as they were to the individual countries.
Mm-hmm.
The only reason that the UK was never really at risk. There was no way that the Royal Navy was going to let one kayak basically get across the channel, let alone an invasion force. That goes all the way back to what are we going to do about the Spanish Armada? Oh, well, we can let it go past and blast it as it goes past and let the storms deal with it, which is what happened. And it's like the amount of oomph, irrespective of the Americans coming on board to a certain extent, the amount of industrial oomph that we could have drawn on as the imperial power and just said, okay, we clearly can't manufacture an aircraft in the UK anymore because we've been bombed to shit.
Mm-hmm.
Well, the same as the Russians just moved it back past the Ural Mountains. We just shove it over to Canada, South Africa, New Zealand, Australia, India, come where you may.
It was an empire after all.
Yeah. And it's like, there's like a handful of countries we haven't invaded, anywhere except there. We could have done business, as it were.
Mm-hmm.
And
it's
and that was Germany's big problem, was they were literally landlocked and couldn't quite reach the oil fields, either in the Russian campaign. The amount of oil coming through Romania was a dribble, basically. And they were desperate to get to Iran, Iraq, Azerbaijan, as we now know it, for the Black Sea oil fields.
Right.
And we just kept them. So why did they lose the war? Oil, basically, and the sheer fact that all of a sudden, 50+% of the people in the world were actually on the Allies' physical side. Brazil's sending troops, albeit in the last couple of years or so. You've now got to physically fight Brazil. You can't reach it. There's no way you can jeopardize it. There's a couple of instances where a U-boat turned up in US territorial waters and they got pushed away because they never really did much.
Right.
A couple of 3-inch shells, maybe, the same as Japan did over on the West Coast. But it's peanuts, absolute peanuts compared to things like a couple of German E-boats that managed to get through the screenage for the Slapton Sands practices for Normandy. They came through and wrecked those exercises, causing much more damage almost than most of the time they did on D-Day. But I thought he has a case, I think, for the socialism bit versus the war practice, the war footing bit, purely on the way that the companies were allowed to operate or not operate, and how many of those companies had Gestapo come SS oversight, stroke negotiated contracts. Oh, and we'll provide you with the labour for cheap, because that's how the SS managed to fund itself, was it was selling the labour.
Yeah. I'll look at, I wasn't familiar with that guy's work. So I'll look at that, because I think it does sound like it has some resonance for the present.
Yeah. The other thing was, I know 2 or 3 meetings ago, or 2 or 3 normal meetings ago, I mentioned the vampire economy as a book, as in a German at the time talking about the Nazi economy.
Oh, okay.
This is the guy that I got the reference from.
All right.
He refers back to that several times. So if you go back into, I can't remember whether I put it in the chat, and I can't remember if I've still got it.
I jotted it
But
down. Thank you.
yeah, Vampire Economy. It's a 1940s book, but still in print.
Cool.
Because people are still using it.
Yeah. So, I don't think, I don't think it would be it'll be that difficult to bring that back around to Piketty, which I did write note cards on. This week I tried taking my notes on.
Chris would get on his high horse again otherwise, wouldn't he?
Green pen is this conversation today, this morning. I don't know that I've made any type of hard and fast. Black pen is what I was writing my notes in. I think I'm using white note cards. I may use a highlighter to color, to kind of color the tops, make a little color line on the tops so I can tell what Kitty wants to play. So I can tell what the what things are sort of reading notes. I don't know what I'm going to call them yet, and what are main notes, that sort of thing. The things that kind of jumped out at me, because I did sort of reread and re-listen to 6 and 7, and it struck me that I kind of feel like I still appreciate Piketty and I like the fact, and I think it's super valuable that he is sort of calling attention to disparities of income and especially of wealth and how they've changed over time. His faith, however, in institutional bureaucracies, and this is where I want to connect it with what you were saying, Tim, talking about socialism and what does he think socialism is. It's kind of getting on my nerves. I really got a sense, again this week, and maybe it sort of even got rubbed in a little bit more this week, that it's very much about. I mean, there's no my image of him, my mental image of him is that he doesn't for a moment consider the idea that the overall size of government might shrink and that might be a good thing, right? He's sort of at the beginning of this whole thing, he sort of conflates the beginning of progressive income tax with actually the beginning of income tax, right? Before 1914, we didn't really have an expectation that in America and I think probably in most of Europe, people did not have the expectation that they were going to be regularly taxed like that. And so before that, I did like that that graph that showed this narrow band of government spending, right? Because the government budget reflected what they were able to raise, and it was mostly they were mostly raising money on tariffs and fees, right? So there was a limit to what they could do. They couldn't even really, have a large standing army or a navy, right? So I think the idea that we would go back to anything smaller kind of seems inconceivable to him, and he does, along the way, he does kind of claim that it's because of it's because of labor unions, it's because of democracy. He even almost goes so far as to say at one point that no government would return to 1914 level spending, and the implication that I read into that page, it was around 127, I think, was that that governments will never retreat from social welfare spending. And that doesn't strike me as real, especially given what he talks about of the Thatcher, Reagan, and Somebody, I think, Pat, in the notes you mentioned Barry Goldwater, right, all the way back to 1964, right? That this, I think that governments like to collect and spend money. I'm not sure that I'm convinced that they have a commitment to education, old age, pensions, healthcare, and general Social Security. I don't know. I'm going on for a bit here. The other thing that I have a question about is the relationship between the labor unions and the workers, and the democracy and the provision of education and retirement benefits. Because in America during the Great Depression, there was a lot, that was the beginning of the second industrial revolution too, which he does mention. And so industry needed more educated workers. They also needed the old guys to get out of the way, right? And that's the reason for Social Security and old age pensions. Chris, are you having trouble with your mic? You look like you were trying to say something.
Fine. Is it working or no?
Yeah, it is now, yeah.
One of your issues, I think, with Piketty is, and it's a very subtle thing that's hard to notice and follow unless you watch it and collect samples of it. But there are, I think, dramatic cultural differences between him as a Frenchman and us as Americans in a cultural perspective, and particularly how, and if you want to, it's a stereotypical thing, but Europeans generally have dramatically different views of whether they trust government more or companies and capitalism more. And that kind of dichotomy is almost perfectly flipped in the United States. Mm-hmm. And that will cause some kind of cognitive dissonance in that type of thing that you just mentioned of he will blindly trust government institutions to do one thing or another versus an American view. And I find it almost kind of hilarious that the Republican Party now will actively say, the worst words in the English language are, I'm from the government and I'm here to help. When in fact, they were the government that was there to help and actually actively screwed things up for particularly indigenous people. Mm-hmm. So there's that as one thing, but when you also think about it kind of in cultural perspectives of what does the broader populace think in terms of will these things work or not work, and by analogy, Americans will look at foreign countries that aren't democracies and essentially say to them, if you had a democracy, you would be better. But you don't have that background and experience, so you need 20 or 30 years or a generation or two of having a democracy to see how it works and know that it will fit. And similarly, we are all in that same situation of you can project forward and think things would be better if we had more equality. But because we're living in a society that doesn't have that, it's much harder to think and see and feel that and know what would, if we did have more equality and we projected ourselves in the future, what would it look like in terms of does government get bigger or smaller with that new worldview? Mm-hmm. But we don't have that worldview, so it's much harder to picture it.
Yeah,
if that makes sense.
Yeah, I think you're right, because I may have been having kind of a almost kind of visceral reaction to it. I rarely feel myself in the libertarian camp, but as I was listening to this again, I was like, I was thinking, yeah, this is what road serfdom was talking about.
In fact, I think Graeber and Wingrove talk about a little of that kind of historical perspective of we can imagine and project ourselves into the future to imagine better futures. And that's one of the positive traits that humans have that have helped us make progress over time. But the problem too is you have to juxtapose that with, okay, what does that mean now for not just my particular instance, and how, as a ostensibly a middle class American, like, I have the fear that somebody's going to come and take all my cookies away.
Yeah.
It's that cartoon we looked at a few weeks ago. But there's some guy across the room who has 50 million cookies, and we should be more concerned with him and not with the guy who has no cookies.
Yeah. It's interesting too, because I was wondering, as I was reading, especially chapter 7, and especially after he starts talking about that kind of salarial state hypothesis from that guy who I haven't read, but I'll kind of look him up someday when I got free time. But I was wondering, sort of what's left then in this, in this kind of small private sector, that he's, the implication that I got was, okay, Uber drivers and, and baristas and maybe some craftspeople, right? Making little one-off things, that people can, that people can buy who have the funds. But and maybe that's, and maybe that is, what's left when we take out all of the people who do, kind of work in these. I haven't actually looked at economic statistics recently for the United States about, how many people work in, what the population of employees of global corporations is relative to, any other, kind of mom and pop economy.
I remember reading, and I think it was the same guy who wrote the book on containerized shipping, wrote a history book about the A&P.
Oh, right, yeah.
And essentially how, the mom and pop grocery store disappeared over the 1900s and was ostensibly replaced by big box grocery, which gives you a lot of efficiency, but it also tends to put a lot more small places out of business, and I can only presume that shift went from a lot of people working for themselves to way more people working for corporations. But I don't know, I'm curious what that number looks like too, in terms of, but it's also made a massive shift too, because the subsistence mode of living, I think in the early 1900s, we flipped from 99% of the world making their living as subsistence farmers to not living that mode.
Right.
So I would presume, if that was the case in the early 1900s, way more people work for corporations with more than 10 employees than don't.
Right. Yeah. And Piketty is going on to, in quite some detail about, this control by by the shareholder who's also an employee, and how it needs to shift at 10. So I'm wondering, how many actual businesses are there with less than 10 employees, that this would apply to, and how many not. I do think that he's right, though, that one of the things that has really, really, really damaged this in the last couple of decades, really since the end of the Cold War, has been this ability, this free flow of, in the global economy, this free flow of capital, but also profits, right? That can be expatriated from the place where they're, where they are created. And so then you get to, and he calls it a new censitary power, right? And it kind of allows these corporations to take advantage of the resources and the infrastructure of a place, and then to sort of liberate the profits from that, and not contribute to the upkeep of that infrastructure and that and those or those resources. And not only like natural resources and mining and things like that, but I remember back in the 80s, it must have been when Seagate, the hard drive company, moved to Ireland, right? And they were, and they made a lot of the fact that, this is great. I mean, there's people go to college for free in Ireland. We've got this educated workforce and all of this stuff. And then, it never invested in Ireland. It basically just, was a free rider on that social infrastructure that had been.
So I made this connection with that too, like why our infrastructure today is not as well maintained in the U.S. as it was when we built it all up when we had this much larger tax base or tax flow, and then they kind of rolled back that with this globalism move in the 80s, and now we can't afford the infrastructure we built when we had that. Is that a right reading, or does that sound correct to other people?
Seems like it.
Yeah, Pat, you were thinking something along those lines, I think, too, in some of your notes.
Although it also reminds me too of a cultural phenomenon that came out of, in part Liverpool, if I recall. The shipping industry became so big that it would, and the kind of the working class person had enough free time with a reasonable job. You could afford guitars and drums, and heavy shipping through there helped fuel the rise of kind of the British invasion of music that came out of a bunch of those British port cities, including the Beatles, that had the time and freedom and flexibility. And you now look at some of those cities, decades on, and shipping is still big in a few of them, but it's not what it once was. And so there's now a little more poverty and way less likelihood that culture would, spin off that kind of creativity now, as a comparison, which.
Right. And they had the free time, right? Because these were mostly working class. I mean, the Beatles were all kind of from working class backgrounds, but they had the capability, which probably says something about, about things being a little bit better for at least some members of the working class, right? That, that some of their sons can, go to art school and, and meet there and decide to,
and it may be availability bias on my side, but almost all of the movies I can remember, or a good number of them from the 50s and 60s in America that had, or were about Britain, were about Britain's working classes rather than the high end or the super low end.
Yeah.
So it's almost like, even from a film and television perspective, that stuff entered the zeitgeist as a result of some of those trade influences.
Yeah. And probably there was, I'm just thinking about about the middle class being bigger, right? Because what was it, 1970-ish? Jethro Tull did Aqualung, and everybody said, "Who's that? Who is represented in that? In that image?" And it certainly wasn't. It certainly wasn't kind of an us. I'm singing. I'm writing about us. I'm writing about them. Maybe adjacent to us, but not really us.
Well, that you also have that kind of feel with Bruce Springsteen and the working class, and he started in the 70s and it, went through the 80s, but now looking back on it, those people in that thing feels like kind of a class myth that's all there is now. It's all working class stiffs, and or the same thing in like the cultural South with country music.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, or Mellencamp and farmers. Yeah. Yeah. It's yeah. I mean, and it did, and Springsteen. I'm not really that familiar. Not a fan, so I'm not that familiar. A couple of the major albums I've listened to, but it did. He did maybe go through a period where it was, it was celebrating it from the inside, and then later, after the '80s, sort of nostalgic about it, about how this used to be a thing, right? And now it's being beaten down. Which is interesting because he, I don't know, is he connected at all with kind of the earlier sort of Woody Guthrie, kind of, and Arlo even, kind of poor people pushing back?
Yeah, I don't know if he's got direct connections. He certainly fits into a piece of that tradition. But if you look at it now, and given his popularity, a lot of his work in music is now being used as, background music at political rallies.
Oh, sure, yeah, and
which
just to wave the red flag at the bull, yeah, yeah, and probably also Mellencamp's I was born in a small town kind of thing is a red blue thing now too. Probably more so than it used to be.
Yeah. Well, it also harkens back to a point in time where manufacturing was the lifeblood of large portions of America. Mm-hmm. We've now offshored massive portions of that in favor of a service economy. But where are the popular musicians who are singing about the service economy?
Right. I guess maybe there'll be a generation of Uber driver songs at some point. Yeah, but not yet. It does kind of seem like there's probably something happening there. There's probably something happening there in a transition from the actual operating industrial second industrial economy and it becoming the Rust Belt, right? So there's a change. So and in the meantime, as we're talking about this, as we're talking about American pop culture in the chat. We're on Great Britain. So bring us back to UTC, Torrin and Tim. So what's the Irish Dutch sandwich?
Broadly, it's a tax scheme by which American corporations will move their corporate headquarters to Ireland or other places to take advantage of doubling and tripling effects of income tax issues. So, and I think Google was probably one of the big ones. They moved a bunch of their corporate entities into Ireland specifically
data centers,
to ostensibly get a 0% tax rate.
Mm-hmm. I've never heard it referred to that way.
If you go back a few years, back when people were still selling PCs through mail order and actual retail shops, mm-hmm. Dell Europe went to Ireland because it was the cheapest from tax point of view for the whole of Europe. Right. And once you're in one country of Europe, that's it. You only need to be in one and you've got free flow of goods within the EU. Same as you've got free flow of people, free flow of education. Mm-hmm. And of course, the other thing that doesn't affect you guys so much is, and it is a small thing until you then find you don't have it, as we didn't before. Obviously, with the size of the US, you've got a 3, 4, 5, 6 hour flight from end to end, right? If I take a 6 hour flight from London, I've passed Istanbul. I'm outside Europe.
Yeah.
Right. So if I stay within Europe, and the thing that I want to be able to do is use my mobile phone, mm-hmm. I used to get hit with overseas roaming calls because I'm not in the country I paid a bill in. Right. And one of the things the EU said was, looking across the pond to the Americas, was that's not fair. Mm-hmm. Plus the fact I've got Deutsche Telekom selling me a phone set in the UK, and I've got Virgin Telecom selling me it in Czech Republic.
Mhm.
And I go to Italy. This is where it really hurts. I go to Italy, and I've got Tim doing my telephone, as in Telefonica Italiana Marina, because obviously marine telephones were mobile before most of our phones were mobile.
Mm.
So, and they've got a nice. So I occasionally use the Tim sign from Italy shops as my Facebook avatar. So it's bright yellow with a black and red Tim. Anyway, so it's one of those things that comes up with. There was that classic James Stewart Takeoff. Not James Stewart.
John.
The guy who plays the Star Trek guy. What does he? Patrick Stewart.
Oh, Patrick.
What did the EU ever do for us? As in the takeoff of the Life of Brian thing, and one of them, of course, in that long list is free roaming telephone calls.
Mhm.
But yeah, I mean our classic. Here he goes. He's going to pull it out from. Yeah, him with hair. Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah.
Okay. Cool.
And the other classic one we see is yes, the Amazon UK,
Mhm.
which predated Amazon France and just about predated Amazon Deutschland as a website stroke buying purpose, was physically based in Luxembourg because there's no tax.
Yeah.
As in that's where it's registered as a business.
Right.
And rather like I've said in the bit about the newspapers, the big Tory newspaper bullshit is the Telegraph. And it's owned by the Barclay family, and they base it in British Virgin Islands because there's no tax. Right? And the same with the Daily Mail. I can't remember where they're based, but the Daily Mail was also included the Mitford sisters, who were guests at Burgers Garden before. Right? How close do you want to get to being a real-time Nazi? I mean, if you look at who the Daily Mail was pushing for the leader, there was this Labour guy who jumped ship to the Tories that then jumped ship again, as in Oswald Mosley, 4 p.m. And he just, outright black shirts versus brown shirts for the UK pre the war started. And of course, as soon as the war started, I'm not quite sure how long, just before or just after, they banged him up on some charge to serve in the peace party. But yeah, and then and of course the other thing that's come through from you, of course, is the privacy standards of the internet use. So all of a sudden, Google Mail and etc. all disappear out of the EU. They go somewhere off in Europe, but off the EU, like Channel Islands. I mean, it's like my overseas bank, right? I mean, I'm out here in Dubai, but I've still got British bank accounts. My British regulated overseas bank is on the Isle of Man, because the Isle of Man is still a royal property and is not inside the EU. It's not part of the United Kingdom. It's in the British Isles. So geographically, it's inside our local geography, same as the Channel Islands are, but it's not in the British Isles. So Manx, the Isle of Man, issues its own passport. It has its own police force. It, like Scotland does at the moment, delegates the defence of its island to the UK.
Mhm.
Same as the Channel Islands does, right? Although they're probably just as easy with the French Navy popping around the corner. And it's one of those really big quirks when non-Brits or people that don't, or even UK people that don't know. It's like, as silly as, you can't have the monarch get in her car and drive across London, inverted commas, from Westminster into the City of London and out into the next borough. The monarch is not allowed to freely enter the City of London without permission.
Right.
Right? And it's literally that square mile. It's as though central Manhattan is denied to the president.
Right. Yep.
But you can go round, but you can't go through. Right. So when you see people like Prince Charles or the Queen going to a funeral or a wedding at St. Paul's, they've been given permission.
Mm-hmm.
Right? Technically,
Gotta
they
keep
have
the
to
Lord
ask.
Mayor busy, right?
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. And of course, there was somebody talking about. Oh yeah, somebody was talking about the Vatican City and about how many people actually live there,
Mhm.
and the number was something stupid like less than 500. There's about 9,000 people that have their primary residence in the City of London. They vote along with all the other legal people there, i.e. all the companies, all the landlords, all the building owners, all the banks, all have a variable number of votes for the Lord Mayor.
Mhm.
And your local ward person, as in an alderman. And that vote comes up periodically. I can't remember how often it is actually. It might be 6 years. So they're in for it for quite a long term.
Mhm.
But yeah, I mean the left versus the right on the UK newspapers is an odd one because clearly the Guardian is far left, yet has also, like in the last 2 years, flipped on the green stroke environmental bit as well, such that you used to get articles in the Guardian berating people for taking all these flights to go on holiday,
Mhm.
next to the advert to say, come fly to Zambia. It's only a 10-hour flight. That stops now. And there's a activist that now works for The Independent who talks on greenish issues, but is big on bicycle side stuff. And so he's often on local radio stations, small TVs and all this of it, when there's been a spate of cyclists being knocked off their bikes by trucks or buses or whatever.
Mhm.
And one of the things he doesn't like is the London black taxi cab, because they have got such a small turning circle because of their special design, which is why they're there.
Mhm.
They're one of the things that knocks most of the cyclists in London off their bike. And because he's campaigning for safer cycling, more cycling, to cut down car journeys, etc., and the knock-on effect of all that.
Right.
He's had death threats from the taxi guys. Yeah?
Yeah.
Absolutely crazy. Anyway, the other, although I don't hear the Daily Hail very often, the Daily Fail is the normal nickname for the Daily Mail, because they, other than the date, and if it's raining, virtually everything in there. Oh, and the cricket score, the football score, the date, and whether it's raining or not is probably the only thing you can trust. And of course, the other thing, of course, is they don't write the adverts, so the adverts are controlled by somebody else. So Adverts don't count. But no, I mean, when I see American movies and stuff, most of which are in suburbia based with the paper boy delivering papers and he throws them off the bike, riding down the street. You can't do that in the UK. We expect our papers to be pushed through the letterbox, especially when we're in single family housing or even in multiple housing, family housing.
Are they pushed through the letterbox by the mail carrier, or is there a dedicated?
No, by the newspaper boy.
There's a dedicated newspaper delivery person. Okay.
Oh yeah. And it's literally a bunch of school kids, boys and girls, that work for the local sweet shop that is also the newspaper shop.
Okay.
And that's a government-controlled monopoly, in effect, as in you never theoretically see two adjacent sweet shops, also newspapers, because there's not enough market. In theory, back when I was a kid. And I had my paper round at one point when I was a kid, 12, 13 years old. And therefore I got to see all the papers.
Yeah.
And that was when I learned you couldn't trust them, because even when it was like, oh, there's been an air crash in Italy, none of the papers could be counted on in which airline, how many people, which direction it was going, what the weather was like. They never could get it right amongst themselves, let alone whatever. And it just creased me up to start with. And so that was when I think I flipped from being, yes, you've told me the world is round type thing, or you've told me this, that, or the other. Like, oh yes, water boils at 100 degrees centigrade. No, it doesn't. It depends on how high you are and what the weather's doing, especially if you've got a decent thermometer, you know. And ever since then, I've been a disbelieving cynic, I think.
It's interesting though. I hadn't really thought about. That's a really decentralized system. If you have people who have subscriptions to papers, and yet that whole subscription business is handled by local shops.
No. If you buy from the paper, they deliver by special post. Most people don't, because they want to buy their paper on the way to work or whatever, or have it delivered for breakfast. The post is not going to be that tight. So, especially if you're in suburban London. If you're in central London, slightly different. But most people buy their own newspaper from their local shop, but they have it delivered from the local shop. So literally, the sweet shops are open really early, such that a van turns up and drops off 500 copies of this paper and another 1,000 copies of that. And then another truck turns up and delivers the other 2 or 3 papers, because they're obviously printed in different places, right? And so the shopkeeper then makes up the bundle and says, this bag of papers is on this set of roads, because you get an immediate set of roads. You don't get everywhere because it's too big a spread. So I used to do about 7 or 8 roads, but there'd only be 200 houses in, and our shop may be delivered to 50 of them. Because obviously there's a level of a semi-monopoly within the zone. And I then went to work for a sweet shop that wanted to deliver newspapers, but couldn't get the license to do it. So they had to stay as birthday cards and anniversary cards, Hallmark type thing, and sweets. And then because the person was interested, they started doing war knitting patterns, which has no restriction against, as it were. Other ones became little mini bookshops, which were restricted because we used to control the price of the book. As in, that's why publishers put a price on the book, that's the price it's going to be in the UK, right? There was, up until mid-70s, late 70s, if there's if there's £1.20 or 10 shillings and sixpence on the book, that's how much it costs.
Yeah.
With the odd exception where you got the remainder shop that discounted everything, as opposed to, and of course, therefore, bookshops were all bookshops at that point. They were almost just bookshops or newsagents.
What was that bookshop
So-
that began in the train stations that became kind of a bookstore monopoly?
W.H. Smith's.
Yeah.
Yeah. So they managed to get all of the railway stations, and they expanded into Penguin paperbacks, and it grew from there. So in my old hometown of Bath, for instance, they're actually outside of a train station. There were 3 W.H. Smiths, and they each slightly specialised in something else. So they all did newspapers and magazines. They all did books. One did more toys than the others. The other one did more CDs and DVDs and VHS tapes. And I can't remember what the other one did as a my speciality is something, because I didn't use that one very often. But oddly enough, W.H. Smith's is here as a sweet shop, because nobody buys newspapers here anymore because COVID. Almost everybody here had a newspaper delivery motorbike deliver their paper, or they used the ones in the coffee shop. Can't use the ones in the coffee shop because they can't sterilise them.
Right.
So they've all disappeared off the shelf now. So coffee shops are slightly different now here.
Oh, I'll bet. Yeah. Yeah. I want to, because I'm looking at the chat as well. What is Nina Strominger talking about in this corporate personhood thing? I just followed that link, and I do not understand what her chart of personhood is measuring.
I only looked at it. I bookmarked it earlier this week to take a deeper look at the actual paper, and it looks like they kind of polled people to say what, and they gave them a broad range, I think, of corporation names, and said, if this corporation were an animal, what would it be?
Okay.
Type of thing.
Okay.
But she's a legal scholar. And I, for a long time, or at least the last year or two, I've been collecting references to corporations as people, what rights they have, what rights they don't have, which I think is how I found that. Because I think that tweet goes back to February.
Okay. Because I would argue, and that's why I didn't get it, because it would seem to me that the way that corporations are perceived is beside the point, right? They have in a legal, I mean, especially if you're looking at it from a legal perspective, the fact that they have the rights of legal people, plus they're immortal, plus they have limited liability, seems to be more the issue than, do people think they're the moral.
And you can't put them in jail.
Yeah.
Or kill them.
Right.
I mean, because let's be honest, if given the level of gun violence in America and the ills that it potentially does, if Amazon were actually a person, ostensibly somebody would have shot it by now.
Yep.
Or other corporations, that continue on.
Yeah.
It was something you mentioned a while ago. In fact, I was going to ask, and it may go back probably 20 minutes. You were talking about expatriation of monies from countries as it relates to equality. And I remember seeing, I was actually kind of surprised to see it because I hadn't seen it on a bookshelf in a while, but I walked through a bookstore earlier in the week and saw, I think it's Walter Rodney's book, How Europe Underdeveloped Africa. If I remember, I think it's from the early 70s, but I saw it literally 8 copies on a bookshelf as new books in a bookstore. So I'm not sure if it's had a reprinting or republication recently, but I was kind of shocked that this, political economy book from the early 70s was back and that had a hang tag in the bookstore as an employee recommending it, and there were 8 copies on the shelf.
Wow.
Which doesn't happen usually with books from the 70s unless they're required reading in local elementary schools or high school.
Right.
Or at least in this one in particular. So, but I'm curious if anybody's read it and what they think about it as a thesis as it relates to Piketty.
From what I understand of its thesis, yeah, I mean, it seems to be pretty sound. That extract. I mean, as I understand it, it's about extraction and and then kind of walking away from the debris that's left afterwards. One of the things that Piketty talks about, right, is this kind of hyper concentration of property, and he spends a lot of time in that last chapter that we read, sort of talking about the really ridiculous extent to which these European imperial powers were doing this in places like Africa, but also, the French in Indochina, and and the ones who always get away with it and get forgotten about are the Dutch in Indonesia. But when he's talking about the hyper concentration, right, he actually says that this has changed a little. And so I don't know if I'm running away from your topic too quickly, Chris, but this idea that up until, in this post-war period until maybe the 80s, there was a, kind of a broadening of middle-class access to, and I think he attributes it to home ownership, right? That, that this hyper concentration of property in the hands of rich people and the businesses that they control, somehow was lessened at some point. And I was kind of wondering about that because, firstly, I was wondering, to what extent do middle-class people ever really own their homes, right? And so if you're 50% plus mortgaged, are you a homeowner? And is that are you a homeowner in name, and and how do you measure that? Do you actually, does an economist actually account for the net value of the home, maybe the appreciation in value above and beyond the because prices have been rising, above and beyond the purchase price, maybe that could be seen as home equity and that could be measured. The other thing that I was wondering about was, public lands. He talks about private ownership a lot, but what about, and again, he's in France, so maybe he doesn't, I mean, in the American West, right, there's a ton of publicly owned land, right? And it's leased to ranchers. It's leased to, to graze on. It's leased to miners or oil companies to mine on or to drill on. And so how does that affect, this measurement of, how much property in our economy is actually.
He really push into his, like, he backs up these charts with a link to his website for more data or something, and I haven't actually opened it. Has anybody?
I didn't follow it either, Justin.
Yeah, maybe we should do that, because like he does at one point point out, I forget, it was in chapter 7 or later, but like net property ownership is like goes -% or something, and I questioned that, but I didn't bother trying to figure out how to really understand what the hell he meant by that. But it was certainly puzzling.
Yeah.
Or it may be I'm trying to remember the exact context too, but it may have been net property ownership, and the negative number is a percentage drop with respect to a pre-existing set standard.
It's a change from a previous condition, though. So
but I think it, at least in America, the kind of that American dream of home ownership was sold as and it became easy enough. It becomes a means of generating intergenerational wealth.
Mhm.
So even if you buy a house and keep it, and you die in it, or you kind of ostensibly own it after your 30-year mortgage,
Mhm.
you then pass it down to your children, who then have some sense of intergenerational wealth. But when you think about, and it's really stark right now in Los Angeles, or in the area where I live, you can buy a house, and with the interest credit you get back from the IRS, which essentially is a tax subsidy to the middle class and above for owning homes,
Right.
you can purchase a home, and your monthly mortgage for maybe a 3-bedroom, and I'll say middle class house, but in Los Angeles, a 3-bedroom home is impinging on $1 million right now to purchase,
Sure.
if not more.
Yeah.
But the rent you're paying on that is maybe $2,500 a month, but that's equivalent to a 1-bedroom or studio rental in Los Angeles right now.
Mhm.
So you can either pay it in rent, and it's just all money going out, and you have nothing to show for it after 30 years, versus you can actually pay slightly less as that rent, and then you own an asset that not only is owned and you can pass on, but in Los Angeles appreciates to the nth degree.
Right. Right.
Even
But it assumes that you have an income tax to offset.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
yeah. So it's interesting, because there are a couple of things that he said about this kind of democratization that I wanted to push back on a little bit. Because at one point he credits democracy and democratic governance and the free press and unions with this. He actually says, for the first time in history, the state escaped the exclusive control of the dominant classes. And I wonder how true that actually is. That this, was this, were there tangible results of this? And maybe there were, maybe you could say that, that the civil rights movement was a potential result of this.
Isn't that like the huge infrastructure that got built, like a extremely tangible result of that? The interstate commerce, like all the, like, that seems to be like what we got in exchange. We got Social Security, and we got infrastructure and some equality when we really fought for it, like rights equality, not like and then opportunity. That's like the dividend of getting out from under control of the dominant classes. At least that was my interpretation.
Yeah, I think that's kind of probably what he's going for, and I think that's generally accurate. But I still wonder about how realistically true it is that in America we got the interstate highway system, right? But who was that for? And so so a lot of these things, appear to be very beneficial for, and we certainly in our history tell the story that this is for. It's like Social Security, as I mentioned earlier, is portrayed as being this New Deal thing that is for. And I use an actual poster from the era in when I'm teaching US 2 of an old lady standing behind a farm fence, an old wooden farm fence, and with very wrinkled face, and it's like basically the implication is we're preventing grandma from starving, and is that what it was? Is that what it was for? Is that who it was for? And is that how it happened? Yeah, I think Chris, I think it was it was the National Defense Interstate Highway Act, right? The idea was that we were gonna haul around, ICBMs on the back on semi trailers and things, intermediate range, at least missiles and stuff.
It's a quirky thing too, but typically in any given 5 mile stretch of United States interstate, at least 1 mile of that stretch is perfectly straight.
So you can land a B-52.
It's a landing strip for military equipment.
Yep, it does. I mean, and it does seem like, and I'm not criticizing that. I mean, that makes sense from a sort of a national defense, during the Cold War, and you could probably make an argument that for civil defense and disaster relief and for a whole lot of different reasons, that's kind of a good thing. But and then Justin, go ahead. And then I want to return. One thing I do want to return to is the influence of the USSR. But go ahead, Justin.
So that argument that all this stuff was like, all the big infrastructure that we got was really like the very industrial complex or something along those like kind of big big objectives, not really fair-minded equality, purposely equality-inducing projects. Like sort of implies that those were all accidental, and or maybe even if you're in a super cynical frame of mind, like unintended consequences or costs that have to be borne in order to achieve a greater level of state autonomy, which is like really kind of like, that doesn't mean it's going to continue except for when we fight for it. But even then, it seems like maybe we just got it by accident and got lucky for a period of 50 or 80 years there in the 1900s.
Well, and I don't know that I want to go quite that far into that, but that's kind of the I'm leaning kind of towards that, Justin, towards the idea that that maybe historically we give, because some of these things were either unintended consequences or sort of ride along consequences that made made these things easier to sell politically, right? But now that's all that's in the history books, right? We got this for this reason, and not because it was good for, it was necessary for national defense, or it was good for business, or any of these other things, which I think it makes it more difficult to understand how change happens and how change might happen in the future. And going to that, I think he makes I think the best thing that I took away from this book so far is Piketty's kind of focus on how the USSR, the existence of the USSR, made space for liberals to talk about things like, to whatever extent they were interested in them, really, to talk about things like Social Security and old age pensions and, a general quote unquote welfare state, right? Because without that counterexample of the Soviet bloc, they wouldn't have been willing to go there. And I think that's an argument that I find kind of compelling, because, especially during the Great Depression, right? I mean, that was before we knew that Stalin was lying about the success of the 5-year plans, right? We thought that the US and Western Europe is, getting crushed, and God, look at Russia, they are thriving. Or look at the USSR.
One of the things that he said a couple of times too, that I think is tangential to that, and I think is broadly ignored, and I kind of want to dig into his sources in the data, but he says several times in multiple chapters that generally when equality goes up, productivity of a country increases dramatically. And to me, that's probably one of the most shocking things I've seen, because you see, especially in the 80s with Reaganism coming in and the reversal of a lot of that equality in the US, our capitalism is still forcing some sort of productivity, and productivity seems to be like the driving thing behind all of capitalism. And yet he's making an argument that all capitalists should sit down and say, hey, we should be more equal because that will actually increase productivity. So let's do more of that. And no capitalist I know is even remotely thinking about that.
I thought that was his biggest mistake, that he, and again, I think you gave him a lot of credit earlier, Chris, for being French and being part of it, being in this European culture and everything, and having these assumptions, that we don't share. But I thought an editor should have cautioned him on that, because this correlation that he believes is causation between, what's happening in the workplace and unionization and democracy and these improvements in these things that he values socially, and the correlate and executive pay. Even he says that too, right? That that in the 80s he makes this, his almost as proof of what you're saying is that, well, and see what happened in the 1980s. Executive pay went way up relative to the workers, and that gap widened, and productivity went down. It's like, well, that was the 1980s. Productivity was going to go down because we had just spent, and US and Western European productivity relative to other people's productivity was going to take a huge hit, because we had just spent 30 years and billions of dollars raising up, Japan, and then Taiwan, and then, all of the other Asian dragons, right? So, so how are we not going to find ourselves at a competitive disadvantage after that, after we've invested in their brand new infrastructure and we haven't done anything about our own? So the fact that executives are getting more money relative to workers may be, kind of metaphorically compelling and maybe very ironic, but it doesn't seem to me to be causal, right? I think it almost proves, it's like a logic problem, right? Where, he's arguing backwards. It only proves the negative, right? That higher executive pay didn't result in greater productivity. It doesn't prove the other claim. So yeah, I think there's something going on there with productivity, but also with industrial cycles that that don't get factored into this to make this this illustration too oversimplified.
I kind of look at some of this stuff too from the perspective of a model essentially out of statistical thermodynamics. And so there is a spectrum of people with a broad spectrum of abilities, earning income, and potentialities. And when you look at, the privilege side is way bigger and heavier in terms of wealth per person. But what if there are 50 Einsteins hiding in the poor, unprivileged part of, let's say, the United States as a mini example within a bigger world sphere, and we're suppressing those Einsteins who are there statistically, they're there. We can't see them, and we're ignoring them completely because they get no resources. But what if 50 years hence, we need them to either be able to compete better or compete against or go to war with an India or a China or some other country. But because we've, from an equality standpoint, we've suppressed them and not given any blood to that part of the body, we don't have them to be able to compete against others. Or similarly, if you want to take that model and apply it to any country anywhere, who might be competing with either nearby neighbors or other countries or, whatever it is. And I rarely, if ever, see anyone make that as, you could ostensibly say, your question, what are these things for? Well, the interstate system is for this or that. But what if you made the argument that equality is good for America because it's a national defense strategy for the next 100 years?
Oh, absolutely. And a competitive advantage strategy, economic competition, potential, state power disputes. It's kind of weird too, because, when he goes off on that Piketty goes off on that long tangent about universal inheritance, or whatever he calls it, right? Inheritance for all. And he says everybody should get, we should take away, if you're a rich kid and you're getting $1 million, we should take $500,000 away of that, and and give it to, give 100,000 each to these suppressed Einsteins, right? But and that will allow them to have the freedom, and and as far as it goes, it makes sense, right? That will allow them to have FU money, and to be able to say, no, I'm not going to take the most the work conditions that are most advantageous to the employer, right? I'm going to have more bargaining power and more leverage because I can say, the hell with that, I'll go and start my own thing. But in order for it to actually work, right, that's again one of those things that, it sort of presupposes, and he actually does admit at one point that, this will only work when we have, guaranteed employment and some type of universal basic income and healthcare and all of these other things. And the thing that I would add would be, obviously education, right? Which is what which Tim just mentioned, that, these Einsteins need to be educated, and they need to be ready to take advantage when there's an advantage to be had.
Well, I think it was probably 3 years ago, Malcolm Gladwell looked at higher education and philanthropy in higher education and kind of made that same argument of all these multi-billionaires are donating all their money to the top 10 schools. Mm-hmm. And that all that money is going to trying to add a minuscule edge to the top 1% of top 1%.
Right, who are only competing with the other top 1% at the other schools.
So he said instead it may be a much better strategy to take all those billions of dollars and dump them into the public education system or even community colleges, so that you have, some blood flowing to the rest of the, body politic and,
mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, I think the thing that, they could pay. They could probably, with the penalty that he's going to pay for not buying Twitter, he could pay a lot of people's college loans too. I think the thing that is, I kind of lost my train of thought there. I did lose it. Keep talking, Chris, because you were reminding me of something that I thought was relevant.
Well, and he also, in fact, he looks at a bunch of other things like that too. One of his other pet peeves is golf courses, which receive massive tax and property subsidies, and especially in the state of California. The way they structure those things, there's just a massive handout going to private golf clubs that could serve as better public garden and public spaces. Mm-hmm. But because of the way we've structured the laws in California, we have propped up this massive golf complex, which I find kind of hilarious. And nobody thinks about it, but when you see what the structure is, the stupid amount of inequality that's built into private golf courses in California. He run some numbers, I think, on the Beverly Hills Country Club, and it would be multiple billions of dollars in annual taxes for the individual. And what they do is they sell little memberships and the memberships get bought and sold from generation to generation. But if you were forced to pay taxes without these special laws, all the golf courses in Los Angeles County would disappear instantaneously because they couldn't afford the tax bill to maintain them.
Right. Not to mention the water rights. Yeah. My thought was actually about public colleges. So thanks for reminding me that yeah, I mean, we used the argument, that whole second industrial revolution argument thing, that I think agreeing with Justin, where Justin was going with the sort of the cynical suggestion was that this was about, creating workers for this new second industrial revolution, where you've got people working in, in more complex industry and in chemicals and, these new technologies. Maybe the irony of the new information economy, right, is that we really don't need that many people. Right. And we don't want to say this out loud too loudly. Right. But, how many people does it actually take to code the new killer app? Right. And so
the thing I don't get about that argument is like that kind of is implying that the people who want to make the money are satisfied with the amount of money they could make. And I just like, how is it possible that they're satisfied with that? Just more smart people around who are educated and capable can make more stuff and you could make more money. So like, why stop? I don't understand. Like,
yeah, but I guess my point was we don't, so maybe the reason that we're not investing in public education is we don't really feel that we need that many people trained at a level where they'll be, where they will.
That means they're satisfied with the amount of money they can make, though, and like people who want money are never satisfied with the amount of money. So I don't understand that.
Well, who is it you're saying that's satisfied, Justin?
Well, it would be like, Jeff Bezos or Elon Musk or Bill Gates or the wealth fund of the monarchy or whatever, like whoever is making money just to make money with money, like they want as many smart people as they can get their hands on. So how are they satisfied with our limited education bandwidth that's not producing all these other smart people? You'd think they would, like, this is my like logic rational. Like, this is what makes sense to me. So I'm clearly missing a piece of the puzzle for these other people who are making these decisions.
I don't know. I mean, but I would imagine that there's kind of a zero sum sort of thinking that, I will find, if I'm Jeff Bezos or if I'm Google, I will find enough people, and it doesn't matter if I'm eating, AWS's cake or Elon Musk's cake, right? I'll get my hands on these people. And I was listening to, what was I listening to? Oh, I was listening to Lex Friedman interviewing that guy, Safadine Moose. And he was talking about, this paucity of actual people who are well enough trained to regulate technology, because the government can't pay anywhere near what the people can earn in the technological, and maybe that partially explains the revolving door element.
I think this is something I said last time, is like we haven't fully exploited the opportunity we have in technology and fundamental research. So if we believe we don't need to add to that really hard foundation of choices, and we just need to exploit what we've already uncovered in the last 100 years, then yeah, maybe we don't need to add more Einsteins. We just need to add more Einstein assistants to like really take advantage of the stuff we've already found. And that I could see, I don't know, like, this is like a bit la la land thinking, because I can't substantiate it by anything. But it seems like the implication is like you don't need to find those suppressed 50 Einstein. You just need to like take a bite out of Tesla's intelligentsia or Google's or whoever you're competing against, and by offering a few dollars more.
Or maybe the fact that things like the internet were an epiphenomenon of other projects, right, and became as big as they are, suggests to these people that the model is maybe not to seek these things, but to just, kind of let them come along. Sorry, go ahead, Chris.
I was going to say, we should probably, as intelligent, informed note takers push back on the myth of the lone genius of the Einsteins, who was not, a genius in the sense that everybody wants to give him that credit for. He worked in, with, and against a huge group of other thinkers. He wrote, he kept notes, he built knowledge over time, and then thus created something. So that even creates an even bigger thing, because if you have a more informed, body of people who are writing and thinking and interacting with each other, that's creating even more value exponentially, because you're thinking not only just for yourself and by yourself, but you're communicating with other people, which tends to have an accelerating factor. So it's not just that, those sparks of genius that we attribute to Einstein are a statistical thermodynamic effect of somebody working in concert with their ideas and other ideas running into each other to create new, more interesting things. And if you could do that more faster, you improve overall output and productivity and quality of life in a broader sense, which means putting money into that lower end of the educational system will ultimately do you 1,000 times better on an exponential scale for doing it today. I've been thinking too, in terms of this equality thing, if America really believes that representative government is a good thing, you could change our system. Instead of electing people, you could lottery people to be your elected representative based on the populations around you, which then would put massive pressure on public education, because the last thing you want is the lottery to choose the dumbest, weakest link. You want all the boats to float up so that whoever it is that gets to be your representative in that lottery system is intelligent enough and knows enough about the world. And I almost guarantee you, if you did a lottery system, you statistically would not find the level of crazy crooks that you have with the current system, possibly.
Yeah, at least you wouldn't be rewarding people who were motivated by that as a, and I mean, it would take people a while to learn how to be corrupt, right?
Yeah.
Once they got in.
Well,
so then we turn them over quickly and they wouldn't, Yeah,
if you're only in office for 2 years or 6 years,
Yeah. I personally think, I agree that more, that a more widely diffused, even if it's a basic education. And Piketty kind of craps on that at one point. He says, that the elite students get a real education, and and the students, like the students I'm teaching at the community and state, colleges and universities, get this crap sort of summary education. I would tend to agree, I think, with you, Chris, that these top 1% of the 1% people who are competing with each other for a slight edge at these elite institutions are wasting so much. I mean, the return on that investment would be so much better spent, kind of raising. I mean, you could raise yourself, half a percentage point and get the edge on the other guy at, if you're at Caltech, get the edge on the MIT guy, but we could use that same money to raise all the rest of the college students in America, 10% or 20%. And that would have a net positive effect, because I think the other thing that all of this assumes is that we actually see the end, right? That there's some type of teleological, thing where we know how progress is going to work. And I think that has been, I think that's the other thing that the fact that the internet came out of ARPA, showed, was that it was an unintended consequence. We didn't know that that was going to happen. We couldn't have prepared for that, right? So the idea that we're going to that we know what the next thing is going to be and we're preparing for it, I think is ridiculous. You know, we need to be throwing our, you know, it's like that. I hate to use biblical parables, but it's you know, we got to cast that seed everywhere, and you know, we don't know where it's gonna.
Yeah, I think I can see the logic of donating $1 billion to MIT versus spreading $1 billion amongst 1,000 other universities around the country. From the person with the $1 billion point of view, is like they feel like the risk of throwing it away amongst those other schools seems like it's like I don't mean I believe that you would be throwing it away. I'm totally on board. Let's give it more money to more people because they're gonna find those few people who are going to succeed more and raise all the boats. Yeah. But from the perspective of like there's way more benefit you get from having a building built at MIT than you get from, I don't know, what do you even get a room named after you at all these other universities? Like, I mean, but Carnegie Mellon saw it the other way around. Like he built all these libraries everywhere, and like that was awesome. So what the hell? Come on, rich people, get with it.
Yeah. Well, and you know, it's kind of funny because the last year or two has sort of, you know, probably soured a lot. It certainly soured. I was never a fan of Bill Gates anyway, but you know, has probably, you know, soured some people on that idea of, you know, billionaire philanthropy a little bit, you know, with no strings attached, with no ulterior motive. You know, that maybe that isn't as much of a thing as we would like to have, you know, would have liked to have hoped that it was. Yeah, anyway, we are at the 100-minute mark now.
I was going to propose that for the next meeting, we just wrap up the book and do I think there's 2 more chapters, right?
Yeah.
8
okay.
and 9.
Okay. That works for me. Yeah. Exiting neo-colonialism and then toward a democratic, ecological, multicultural future. So I think it's going to have less, you know, especially the concluding chapter will have less actual economic stuff in it that we need to grapple with. Or so what, Tim? 50 years since the film.
That'll give Dan a week to fill up that card index behind him.
Absolutely, yeah. Well, I've got a pile of cards from today that I made for this. I've got my card of notes. I'm going to keep a little tab of notes from our discussions. I am really enjoying this, just playing around. I don't know. I mean, maybe at some point we'll talk more about, you know, kind of the note-taking thing a little bit more too. I'm feeling energized again. I like it, Dustin, about the whole, you know, about the whole idea of getting stuff out the other end. Pat, I did download and I actually started taking the numbers from these cards and making at least a sketch in the brain so that I can follow these trails, because the fear that I've had about paper Zettelkasten has been, you know, that idea that, you know, it's going to be a black hole and I'll put a note in there and I'll never be able to find it again because I didn't connect it to the right thing that, you know, that sort of spurs my thoughts. But
I'm making a run at it again because I feel like the intentional friction of slowing down and not like it's so easy to fall into the trap of just like any idea that you see in the book that you like, you convert it. For me, I know this seems to work really well for you, Chris. So I'm not at all like trying to impugn your method. But for me, it doesn't work. So I have to like try to convert it to my own idea, and it's so easy to just paraphrase what they said rather than reinterpret it into my own thing. And that's the thing I'm like practicing right now.
Mm-hmm. That's what I was practicing this time too. Go ahead, Chris.
Yeah, I do. There is a large, you know, I see it maybe an iceberg analogy is best, but I do have a lot of fleeting notes that are the iceberg below the water. But I also give heavy preference to the bigger ideas and insights I find that are my own outside of all the other things, which is the big tip of the iceberg that sticks above. And within my system, I give huge heavy preference to focusing on that versus all the rest. Now, all the rest is there and I have it and I can search it and look through it and it's useful, especially for search purposes.
Yep.
But I have like a special carved niche of here's the best of the best stuff. And it may be, you know, if you think of, and I've been collecting examples, historical examples of people who do this and what their card output is per day, particularly in the handwritten versions.
Mm-hmm.
And it typically tends to be between less than one card a day to maybe 2 or 3 in general. Over his lifetime, I think Luhmann did roughly about 6 per day, but he was an academic who did this constantly.
Right, that was his job.
So if you're not that, a smaller output, I think Roland Barthes did like maybe 1.5 a day for decades. And he produced a reasonable large amount of stuff as well, and is probably much better known than Luhmann for his thought and quality of thought. So, you know, focus on that top 1% of 1% of your own stuff and do that. And I think that will help immensely.
Yeah, I think that's what my cards are becoming, is sort of the thoughts that I have about the stuff which is going to remain in Obsidian. You know, the data, the input side, I think is gonna continue going into Obsidian. You know, going in. I mean, you know, I'm highlighting in Kindle. I'm highlighting in, you know, with Hypothesis. It's getting swept in there, and it's all. I think it's all data. But then.
But if you guys are playing around with 25, 50, even 100 cards of Dead Tree, what happens when you have a much more open question and you would be, say, wanting, like my Evernote database of notes is 25,000 notes, of which half are probably mine and the other half are mainly quotes stroke collected chunks of one sentence or even a whole page. You know? And I turn around and say, okay, let's talk about whatever, right? And we pick something that, rather like some of these books have done, the first book we had, I knew nothing of in that direct sense. I knew some of the names, I knew some of the places, I knew some of the dates, but I had no idea that the Jesuits, as it were, spent 20 years learning Candy Rock's language and teaching him French, such that they could have a debate with him in that context. So that was an eye-opener. I just hadn't thought of it in that context. Yes, ultimately, yeah, The Last of the Mohicans, there was clearly something to play. Somebody taught us whites how to play lacrosse and all the rest of it.
Yeah.
But I had no idea that there was elements of, it went past lacrosse or the Three Sisters to farm with beans and corn and squash or whatever. Right? I hadn't thought of it. I'm not that politically minded in that context. Yeah, if I turn around and said, okay, we've got your 2 years of 25 cards a month, say, and we've got my whatever in 2 years' time, my 30,000 cards. Let's talk about the ability of using acoustic air conditioning. You're fucked, right? Basically, you've got no chance because you won't have a link in there to say, for instance, the James Watt telescope that has the most efficient acoustic-driven air conditioning going. You know, because that's where the final step of cooling goes for the.
I would say my response to that would be, yeah, that will still be in my Obsidian vault. If I had an argument about it, if I have a comment on it, if I have my own take on it, that will be in the drawer.
Yeah, and my response is, I don't know what I do in that situation. I'm going to worry about that later because I'm trying to organically grow a system that actually works for me. So,
and what I'm trying to do is have like my source notes in Obsidian, where I have like several paragraphs of notes on one subject and whatever, and then break them down into individual sections to then put onto a card.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, see, and I guess motivation is a big issue, right? My motivation for this was I was having trouble getting stuff out of Obsidian, right? Where I was, I am at the point where I want to put all of this in a row. I want to put all of these thoughts in a row and create a monograph, right? Create a revise my writing handbook with note-taking stuff. So I go to Obsidian and I do my searches for note-taking and Zettelkasten and then, all of the different keywords. And some of them I had grouped together in a folder. Other ones are just out there or in daily notes or all of that. I feel like I need to have a way to organize that so that I can then say, okay, this one goes first and that one, and then write it. That's what this is for.
And do what Scott Shepherd does. He has this separate table and he lays all the cards out in order of the book, and lays all out in order and has the cards in rows and lines.
Right, exactly. Which I Justin Post-its. Oh yeah. I had that. I mean, there is a kind of a corkboard feature in Scrivener, and that's what I used for my dissertation. So yeah, I'm kind of feeling like this might become some type of a hybrid structure, because I like the, and that might actually sort of get me over. Remember it seems like months ago, I was saying to everybody, I'm allergic to any type of automation in my Obsidian world, right? I don't want Readwise, sweeping stuff in. I don't want other apps, kind of, massaging stuff and doing stuff for me in there. And then I gave in to Readwise, and so that was the dam breaking and all that. But maybe, maybe this will give me, will make me feel less like, I'm missing an opportunity in Obsidian if I have it somewhere else in a combination of, cards and the brain. And right now I'm thinking of the brain really kind of only as a map of my cards, but maybe Pat, you'll talk me into doing more than that. I haven't committed to the pro, so I'm not adding any other media or anything like that or any outside links because I'm not sure I want to spend the money. But
I'll give you one weird data point. I've been chatting a lot with Jerry Mikulski, who's been using the brain for 25 years almost. And it's incredibly impressive, the links he's got between things that recreates context. Although I think he tends not to write as many direct, sub notes, or he doesn't write things out. He's connecting ideas.
I was looking at his brain, and there was a lot of wiki links and things like that.
Yeah, but I've been on calls with him, and probably 10 hours of calls now, and it's fun to watch him share his screen and show how he uses it and what he's doing with it. And it is super impressive. And having it as a digital thing, there are affordances he's getting out of doing that we don't have in any of these systems. But I also know he's in the midst of trying Zolt's Excalidraw related stuff with Obsidian. And I think he's worried that it's such a closed system that if the creator dies and the company disappears, he'll still have all the data, but he won't be able to use it and function the same way. So he's looking at, how do I get out and do something else that preserves that functionality? Mm-hmm. So there's that as a data point. And I'll say too, right now I'm doing 2 separate experiments because there's very little data within the space of how do people actively use these sets of notes to functionally create outputs. You have collections of people's notes and you have the outputs, but how did they actually, from a user experience perspective, get from A to B? and there's almost nothing on that. So as an experiment, I'm trying out. I have printed out a bunch of notes I took while reading Tiago Forte's book,
Right.
of which there I think are 192 or 93, literally sprawled all over my desk under my computer here. If that helps. It's crazy, and it's annoying, and there's a lot of them. But I'm using that as a means of sorting through them and creating an outline on my desk of what each section of the review should be. And that is Conrad Gessner's version of the early Zettelkasten from the 1500s. And then separately, I'm trying an Obsidian experiment for a chapter I'm writing on the history of knowledge graphs that's due in September. So we'll see how that works. But I have massive amounts of notes and data I've taken over the last 2 years that I can draw from, but it's literally either cutting and pasting stuff into an outline or making an outline and transcluding specific pieces of notes that I have to do the search and find, or go from one note and look at strings of what's around it to find other things to cut and paste into that outline,
Right.
which is painful and very manual a process. The nice part is when I'm done, I can just kind of hopefully lightly edit it and we're finished.
Yeah.
But it's more work than I expected it would be for doing it.
Right. Well, that's the whole Memex dream, right? That you'd be able to grab a piece of this and that and comment on it, and it would flow into a new document. It's for me the problem is the repeatability. It's like, where the hell was that?
Well, if I had a user interface that looked like what Tom Cruise used in Minority Report, and I could have a screen in front of me with all of it, and I could move it, that would be great. But that really does not exist yet in computer land for doing and managing. I have a corpus of, probably 50,000 notes over the span of a decade or more. Right. How do you do that? Right. And search and find it and put it where you want it?
See you later, Tim. The thing that I thought was kind of a good reminder was when I was walking around the block with my dad, when I was out there, when I visited, and he was reminding me of, kind of when he switched, like halfway through his dissertation, he switched from typewriter to, a 512K Fat Mac. And then he no longer had to physically cut and paragraphs and tape them onto a page. So we have to measure. I guess it helps to measure progress over generations.
I'm just barely old enough to remember putting together newspapers that way, where you took little snippets and you literally glued them onto the page and then copied the page.
Yeah.
But there are a lot of the younger digital generation has no conceptualization of what that looks like, how that works. And there's nothing that mimics it in the digital space.
Well, and it's kind of weird. Yeah. PageMaker used to kind of, but now has kind of evolved. I don't know if it's evolved past that. I don't know if today's, sort of digital natives who had never seen that type of layout, look at something like InDesign and think, why the hell does this work like this?
Scrivener may be about the closest I know in the digital space, but I don't know of a lot of digital tools that allow that kind of ease of use of how do you rebuild things for, I've got 1,000 little things in a container. How do I take them and put them into an outline to create something?
Yeah. Anyway, now we're at 120 minutes, so we better cut this off. Tim has failed. We'll finish the book up next week, and then we'll decide what to do next, I suppose.
Sounds good. Thanks, Dan.
All right. Thanks. Good to see you.
Yeah.